What avoidants secretly do at night when they miss you starts long after the world assumes they've moved on. It starts when the notifications stop buzzing, when the conversations end, when the distractions finally run out of places to hide, because daytime is easy for avoidance. Daytime gives them somewhere to put their attention: work, friends, music, errands, gym sessions, endless scrolling, random conversations that mean nothing but temporarily fill silence. Daytime allows them to perform emotional distance convincingly enough that even they start believing it themselves. But nighttime is different. Nighttime removes witnesses, it removes momentum. And once the world gets quiet enough, avoidants are left alone with the one thing they spend most of their life trying to outrun: unresolved emotion. That's the part people rarely understand. Avoidants are not emotionless, they are emotionally delayed. They suppress things so efficiently that feelings often arrive hours, weeks, or even months after the moment that caused them, and nowhere does that emotional delay become more obvious than late at night when their defenses are too exhausted to keep protecting them. Suddenly, the person they spent all day pretending not to think about becomes impossible to stop thinking about. A random memory appears out of nowhere. A phrase you used to say echoes in their head. The silence inside the room starts feeling heavier than usual. And the strange part is, most avoidants never talk about this side of themselves openly because vulnerability feels safer in private than in front of another person. So if you've ever stared at your ceiling wondering whether the avoidant who pulled away ever secretly misses you after dark, subscribe right now, because this channel is for the people trying to understand the emotions nobody says out loud. The first thing that happens at night is the collapse of distraction. During the day, avoidants survive emotionally by staying mentally occupied. Their nervous system depends on movement because stillness creates emotional exposure. That's why so many avoidants seem hyper-independent or constantly busy after emotional conflict. It's not always productivity, sometimes it's escape disguised as productivity, but nighttime strips that away piece by piece. There are no more tasks left to complete. No more conversations left to hide inside. No more performances of emotional control for the outside world. And once those distractions disappear, the emotional static they suppressed all day starts rising to the surface. Suddenly they remember things they didn't let themselves feel earlier. The way your voice softened during serious conversations, the exact moment your energy shifted toward the end of the relationship, the look on your face during moments they emotionally withdrew instead of reassuring you. These memories arrive quietly at first, almost harmlessly, but avoidants struggle with one thing most people never notice: once a memory gets through their emotional walls, it tends to stay there. They replay moments obsessively in private because their mind is trying to process emotions they postponed feeling in real time. And since avoidants rarely express vulnerability outwardly, those emotions remain trapped internally, circling through their thoughts during the quietest hours of the night. That's why nighttime affects avoidants differently than it affects most people. During the day, they can maintain emotional distance because their brain stays externally focused, but late at night, the nervous system slows down enough for emotional truth to slip through. The exhaustion lowers defenses, the silence removes stimulation, and suddenly emotions they buried beneath routines become impossible to ignore. This is when avoidants often start replaying conversations they pretended didn't matter at the time. Tiny details become emotionally loaded now. The argument they brushed off casually suddenly sounds heavier in hindsight. The message they left unanswered suddenly feels cruel instead of harmless. The moments where you asked for reassurance replay differently now because deep down they know you weren't asking for too much. You were asking for emotional presence they didn't fully know how to give consistently. And this is what makes nighttime so psychologically dangerous for avoidants. It forces emotional reflection without distraction. They begin hearing things beneath the words now. The disappointment hidden inside your silence, the exhaustion behind your patience, the sadness in moments they interpreted as pressure while the relationship was happening. Because avoidants often don't understand the emotional consequences of their distancing behaviors until they're alone long enough to actually feel them. In real time, self-protection dominates everything, but at night, reflection takes over instead. And one of the most common things avoidants secretly do during these hours is check your social media without interacting at all. Quietly, repeatedly, almost ritualistically. Not because they necessarily plan to reach out, but because observing you from a distance feels emotionally safer than direct vulnerability. They watch your stories without liking anything, revisit old pictures they already memorized, search for clues about whether you've moved on emotionally, analyze captions for hidden meanings that probably aren't even there. And what makes this behavior emotionally complicated is that avoidants often convince themselves they're just curious, when in reality they're emotionally checking whether access to you still exists. Because even after separation, avoidants often feel comforted simply knowing the emotional connection has not disappeared completely. The possibility matters to them, the idea that maybe you still think about them too. But social media also becomes emotionally torturous because every post forces comparison between your visible life and their invisible emotional state. If you seem happy, they wonder whether you've already detached completely. If you seem distant, they wonder whether they caused permanent damage. And if you stop posting altogether, the silence itself becomes emotionally loud. Avoidants rarely admit how much emotional energy they spend observing quietly from the shadows because it contradicts the detached image they work so hard maintaining outwardly. And beneath all of this is something even more revealing. Avoidants quietly recreate your presence in small ways at night without fully realizing they're doing it. They listen to songs connected to you even when they tell themselves not to. They revisit places emotionally tied to memories you shared. They keep routines you introduced into their life because changing them would force acknowledgement of your absence. Sometimes they sleep on one side of the bed while instinctively leaving the other untouched longer than they'd ever admit. Sometimes they reread old conversations not to reopen wounds, but to briefly feel emotionally close to you again without risking actual contact. Because what avoidants secretly crave at night is emotional familiarity, not necessarily conflict, not necessarily reconciliation, just the temporary comfort of feeling connected again, even privately. And this is where the contradiction inside avoidance becomes impossible to ignore. The same person who seemed emotionally distant during the relationship can become deeply emotionally attached in private once distance becomes real. Because avoidants often process love backward. Presence overwhelms them. Absence clarifies emotions. So while everyone else sleeps assuming they've already moved on, avoidants are often lying awake in the dark revisiting pieces of someone they never fully stopped carrying emotionally at all. And eventually, during one of those quiet nights where emotions feel too close to ignore, avoidants start doing something they almost never admit to anyone, typing messages they never send. It usually begins impulsively. A sudden emotional wave hits after seeing something that reminds them of you, or after replaying the relationship in their mind for hours longer than they intended. They open the conversation thread, stare at your name for a while, maybe reread the last messages between you both again. Then slowly, carefully, they begin typing. Sometimes it's casual at first, pretending not to carry emotional weight. Sometimes it's deeply vulnerable, the kind of honesty they struggled expressing during the relationship itself. They write things like, "I've been thinking about you," or "I hope you're doing okay," or entire paragraphs admitting emotions they buried for months. But then fear enters the room, fear of rejection, fear of looking weak, fear that you've already moved on emotionally, fear that vulnerability might not be welcomed anymore. So they reread every word repeatedly, overanalyzing how it sounds, imagining every possible response, until eventually they delete the message entirely and place the phone back down beside them. And what hurts is that people often assume avoidants don't care because they remain silent, without realizing how many conversations never made it past the draft stage. Silence does not always mean absence of feeling. Sometimes it means the feeling became too overwhelming to risk exposing directly. This emotional conflict usually grows strongest after midnight, when exhaustion lowers the emotional defenses they spent all day maintaining. There's something about those late hours that strips avoidance down emotionally. The world feels slower, their thoughts feel louder, and suddenly emotions they kept controlled throughout the day begin surfacing all at once. This is often when the emotional crash happens, not dramatic crying every night like people imagine heartbreak looks, but waves of quiet emotional heaviness they cannot fully explain even to themselves. They stare at ceilings longer, sleep becomes harder, their chest feels tight for reasons they can't logically organize. Certain memories begin replaying involuntarily now, especially the softer ones. The nights you stayed on the phone together, the comfort of your presence during stressful periods, the moments where they almost let themselves feel fully emotionally safe before fear interrupted it again. And what makes this stage especially painful for avoidants is that nighttime removes the emotional armor they rely on during the day. They are no longer distracted enough to pretend the connection meant less than it did, so they start confronting truths they spent months suppressing. Maybe you were more patient than anyone before you. Maybe your emotional consistency actually scared them because part of them became dependent on it. Maybe they pushed away the very thing they secretly needed most. These realizations rarely arrive cleanly or all at once. They hit in fragments during sleepless nights, building slowly until emotional avoidance itself starts feeling emotionally exhausting. That's why many avoidants try desperately to distract themselves before reaching this emotional point. They stay awake intentionally sometimes because exhaustion feels easier than reflection. Hours disappear through endless scrolling, gaming, binge-watching, random videos, meaningless conversations, anything that prevents silence from settling in completely. Some even fall asleep with noise playing constantly because complete quiet forces them inward emotionally. And the strange thing is, most avoidants are aware they're distracting themselves. They know they are avoiding deeper feelings, but avoidance becomes instinctive because emotional confrontation feels destabilizing for people who built their identity around self-control. So instead of processing missing you directly, they numb themselves gradually night after night. But emotional suppression has limits. Eventually, the distractions stop fully working, the videos blur together, the conversations feel empty, the entertainment stops covering the emotional static underneath it all, and once that happens, they begin slipping into fantasies they would never openly admit. Fantasies about accidental reconnection, running into you unexpectedly somewhere familiar, receiving a message from you first so they wouldn't have to risk vulnerability themselves, imagining scenarios where you both reconnect naturally without needing to confront all the pain directly. Because avoidants often crave emotional closeness while simultaneously fearing the emotional exposure required to initiate it honestly. And these fantasies become especially intense because memories feel stronger in the dark. During the daytime, memories compete against noise, responsibilities, and distractions, but at night, emotional memory expands. Tiny details suddenly feel vivid again. The way you looked at them during moments they felt emotionally overwhelmed, the feeling of your presence beside them during quiet nights together, the emotional safety they experienced in fleeting moments where their defenses temporarily dropped. And avoidants tend to become deeply attached to emotional atmosphere even if they struggle verbalizing attachment openly. They remember how certain moments felt in their nervous system, the calmness, the familiarity, the relief of not needing to perform emotional independence constantly around someone. That's why nighttime nostalgia hits avoidance differently. It isn't always about missing specific events, it's about missing emotional states they rarely access with other people. The feeling of being emotionally known without being forced open, the comfort of existing beside someone who understood their silences without demanding immediate explanations. And once those emotional memories begin resurfacing consistently at night, avoidants often realize something deeply uncomfortable. They are comparing everyone else to you privately now. New conversations feel emotionally thinner. Surface-level attraction no longer satisfies the same way. Because once someone reaches an avoidant beneath the emotional walls, ordinary detachment no longer feels as fulfilling as it once did. And beneath all these nighttime rituals sits something even heavier that avoidants rarely confess openly: guilt. Quiet, persistent guilt that grows stronger in solitude. During the relationship, self-protection dominated their reactions. Distance felt necessary. Withdrawal felt justified. Emotional space felt like survival. But at night, when they replay everything slowly enough, they begin seeing your side more clearly. They remember how many times you tried communicating calmly before becoming emotionally exhausted. How often you asked for reassurance while they responded with silence, defensiveness, or emotional shutdown. How many moments you reached toward them emotionally while they instinctively stepped backward instead of forward. And perhaps the most painful realization for avoidance is understanding that your emotional needs were not always unreasonable. They simply triggered fears inside them they didn't know how to manage properly. That awareness creates enormous private regret because avoidants are often far more emotionally self-aware after separation than they appeared during the relationship itself. The problem is that awareness usually arrives too late, during lonely nights when there's nobody left beside them to explain it to anymore. And one of the quietest things avoidants do at night when they miss you is revisit old messages like they're searching for emotional evidence. Not just casually scrolling, but studying conversations almost like hidden clues exist inside them now. They reread moments where you sounded happy with them, the nights where the connection felt effortless before fear complicated everything, the conversations where you tried to understand them gently instead of attacking them. Because once avoidants are alone long enough to stop defending themselves emotionally, they often begin searching backward through the relationship, trying to understand where things changed. They replay arguments differently now. Messages they once interpreted as pressure suddenly read like pleas for emotional closeness. The reassurance you asked for no longer sounds too needy in hindsight, it sounds human. And perhaps the most painful part is that avoidants often recognize your love most clearly after they no longer have direct access to it. so those old conversations become emotionally dangerous territory at night because they temporarily bring your presence back into the room. For a few moments, it almost feels like the relationship still exists untouched somewhere in time. Your words still carry warmth. Your attention still feels accessible. Your care still feels alive inside the screen. But eventually, reality returns again. The conversation ends. The phone locks. The room goes quiet, and the absence hits all over again. That's usually when avoidants begin imagining what you're doing without them. Not casually either, deeply, obsessively sometimes. They wonder if you still think about them before sleep, if someone else is slowly replacing the emotional space they once occupied in your life. If you've healed completely while they're still emotionally stuck revisiting memories at 1 in the morning. And this uncertainty becomes psychologically brutal for avoidants because they often rely on emotional distance to feel safe, yet once real distance exists, they lose control over the connection entirely. During the relationship, even conflict carried a strange kind of security because access still existed, but now they no longer know where they stand in your emotional world. Maybe you hate them, maybe you've detached peacefully, maybe you rarely think about them at all anymore. And strangely enough, that last possibility often hurts avoidants the most. The idea that someone who once emotionally revolved around them has now emotionally moved beyond them completely, because avoidants unconsciously depend on emotional permanence more than people realize. Even while distancing themselves, part of them quietly believes the connection will remain waiting in the background indefinitely. So nighttime becomes filled with imagined versions of your life now. They picture you laughing with new people, sleeping peacefully, healing, becoming emotionally stronger without them, and every imagined scenario forces them to confront the possibility that they may have permanently lost access to someone who mattered far more to them than they knew how to express at the time. Meanwhile, the loneliness they carry during these nights rarely matches the image they present to the world. That's one of the most misunderstood things about avoidance. Externally, they can appear calm, detached, productive, even emotionally unaffected. Friends may genuinely believe they moved on quickly because avoidants are skilled at compartmentalizing pain publicly, but loneliness for avoidants usually unfolds privately and silently. It hides beneath routines, beneath distractions, beneath the carefully controlled version of themselves they show everyone else. And nighttime strips those performances away. Suddenly they are left confronting how emotionally empty certain things feel without you there. The bed feels bigger, the room feels quieter. Their routines feel strangely hollow now that the emotional familiarity attached to you is gone. And because avoidants are not naturally expressive with vulnerability, they often sit with this loneliness alone for long stretches without telling anyone how deeply they are actually struggling. Some nights they convince themselves they prefer isolation. Other nights the silence becomes unbearable. And what makes this so emotionally complicated is that avoidants often crave closeness most intensely during the exact moments they feel least capable of reaching for it. So instead of contacting you directly, they sit there carrying emotional weight internally, hoping the feeling fades by morning while secretly knowing it probably won't. This becomes even more intense months later when delayed emotional processing fully catches up to them, because avoidants often do not experience heartbreak in chronological order. While others may collapse emotionally immediately after separation, avoidants initially survive through suppression. But eventually, all the emotions they postpone begin resurfacing unexpectedly during quiet nights, sometimes long after everyone assumes they should be over it already. And this delayed grief can feel incredibly disorienting because they suddenly start feeling the relationship more deeply after it's already gone. Moments they minimized emotionally during the relationship now feel enormous in hindsight. They start understanding your importance through absence. The emotional safety you offered becomes clearer once they no longer have it. The consistency they once took for granted suddenly feels irreplaceable. And perhaps the hardest realization is recognizing how much emotional intimacy actually mattered to them despite spending the relationship acting conflicted about it. That's why avoidants often become haunted by ordinary memories at night months later. Not just dramatic moments, but simple things. The sound of your laughter during quiet evenings.